Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the moment Johnny Carson's mask finally slipped and the words Johnny Cash spoke that broke him on live television. It was May 1992. The Tonight Show was ending. 30 years of controlled smiles, perfectly timed jokes, and a host who never ever lost his composure were coming to a close. Johnny Carson had built an empire on emotional distance. He was the man America trusted precisely because he never revealed too much. He laughed, but not too hard. He listened, but never confessed. For 3 decades, millions watched him 5 nights a week, and nobody truly knew him. But on one of his final nights, something changed. Johnny Cash walked onto that stage carrying more than a guitar. He carried the weight of a friendship that stretched back to 1963, back when Carson was still new to the chair, and Cash was fighting demons that would have destroyed lesser men. They had shared stages before. They had exchanged stories in green rooms, spoken quietly about things neither man would ever discuss in public. But this night was different. Carson knew it was ending. Not just the show. Something larger. The audience that night did not know what they were about to witness. They came expecting the usual format. Some jokes, some music, some carefully managed sentiment, as America's most famous talk show host prepared to say goodbye. What they got instead was a moment of raw, unguarded humanity that neither man had planned. Because Johnny Cash did something that night that he rarely did. He stopped performing. And when he did, Johnny Carson had nowhere to hide. The history between these two men was deeper than most people understood. They were not just host and guest. They were not simply two professionals who crossed paths in the machinery of American entertainment. They were two men who recognized something in each other that the public never saw. Both had learned to survive by concealing. Carson grew up in Norfolk, Nebraska, in a home where affection was rationed and approval was scarce. His mother, Ruth, was a woman of sharp edges and cold distance. She never told him she loved him, never said she was proud. He learned early that safety meant control, that vulnerability was weakness, that the best way to navigate the world was to keep people at arm's length while making them believe they knew you. Cash grew up in Dyess, Arkansas during the Depression, in a family that loved hard but lived under the constant shadow of loss. His older brother Jack died in a sawmill accident when Johnny was 12. The guilt, the grief, the sense that he should have been the one who died, these things never left him. He learned that pain could be worn like a coat, that you could carry unbearable weight and still walk out on stage and sing. 2 men, 2 different paths, the same strategy. Hide what hurts, perform what people expect, survive. Their first meeting was in 1963, Carson's first year as host of The Tonight Show. Cash was 31 years old, already famous, already struggling. The pills had him. The marriage to Vivian was fracturing. He was 3 years away from the divorce, 5 years away from June Carter becoming his wife, 7 years away from Folsom Prison and the album that would resurrect his career. But in 1963, he was just a man trying to hold it together. Carson saw it. He saw the exhaustion behind the eyes, the slight tremor in the hands, the way Cash held himself like a man bracing for impact. And Carson, who knew what it meant to hide, did something unusual. He asked gentle questions. He gave Cash room to breathe. He did not push. After the taping, they spoke backstage, not for long, just a few minutes. But something passed between them, a recognition, an unspoken agreement. I see you, and I will not expose you. Over the next 29 years, Johnny Cash appeared on The Tonight Show more than 50 times, more than almost any other musical guest. And every time, Carson treated him with a respect that bordered on reverence. He never asked the cruel questions, never mocked the struggles, never made Cash into a punchline, because Carson understood what it cost to walk out into those lights and pretend everything was fine. By May 1992, both men had changed. Carson was 66 years old, preparing to leave the only thing that had given his life structure for 3 decades. The Tonight Show was not just his job. It was his identity. It was the place where he was in control, where he could manage every variable, where he was safe. Retirement terrified him. He never said this publicly. He smiled through the farewell episodes, made jokes about golf and free time, played the role of the man who was ready to step away. But people close to him knew. His son Richard had died in a car accident in 1991. His third marriage was stable but distant. He had no close friends, only colleagues and acquaintances. The show was all he had, and now it was ending. Johnny Cash at 59 was in a different kind of twilight. The commercial success of the 1970s had faded. Country radio had moved on. He was not irrelevant, but he was no longer the force he had been. He was 3 years away from meeting Rick Rubin, 3 years away from the American recording series that would redefine his legacy. In May 1992, he was a legend that the culture had quietly set aside. But he was sober. He had been sober for years. The demons that nearly killed him in the 1960s were still there, but he had learned to live with them. He had June. He had his faith. He had the hard-won knowledge that survival was its own kind of victory. When the call came to appear on one of Carson's final shows, Cash did not hesitate. He knew what it meant. This was not just another booking. This was a goodbye between two men who had walked parallel paths for nearly 30 years. Two men who had never spoken openly about what they shared, but who understood each other in ways that required no words. Cash knew that Carson was afraid, and he knew that Carson would never admit it. So he decided to do something risky. He decided to tell the truth. The taping was scheduled for late May, just days before Carson's final broadcast on May 22nd. The studio audience was larger than usual, filled with people who wanted to witness history. The atmosphere was charged with a strange mixture of celebration and mourning. Carson walked out to thunderous applause, as he had done thousands of times before. He smiled, he waved. He delivered his monologue with the same precise timing that had defined his career. Everything was controlled. Everything was managed. Then he introduced Johnny Cash. The applause was immediate and sustained. Cash walked out slowly, dressed in black as always, carrying his guitar. He shook Carson's hand, sat down, and for a moment the two men just looked at each other. The audience quieted. Carson started with the usual questions. How was the tour going? What was June up to? Small talk, safe talk, the kind of exchange they had performed dozens of times before. But then something shifted. Carson asked about the early days, about the struggles, about what it had taken to keep going when everything was falling apart. And Cash, instead of deflecting, instead of offering the polished anecdote he had told 100 times, paused. He looked at Carson, really looked at him, and he said, "You know what it's like, Johnny. You know what it costs." Carson's smile faltered, just for a second. The cameras caught it, a flicker of something unguarded. Cash continued, "We spend our whole lives trying to be what people need us to be. We get good at it. We get so good that sometimes we forget who we are underneath." The studio was silent. This was not the script. This was not the performance. Carson tried to regain control. He made a small joke, tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But Cash did not follow. "You've given people 30 years of comfort," Cash said quietly. 30 years of showing up, night after night, being steady when the world wasn't. That's a rare thing, Johnny. That's a weight most people can't imagine. Carson's jaw tightened. He was struggling. The audience could sense it. This was not the smooth, controlled host they knew. This was a man being seen. "But what happens now?" Cash asked. "When you're not here anymore, when you don't have this to hold on to? Who are you when you're not doing this?" It was the question Carson had been avoiding for months. The question he could not answer. His eyes glistened. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold it back. The camera stayed on his face. Millions of people watching. The man who never broke, breaking. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Cash did not look away. He did not soften the moment. He held Carson in that uncomfortable, necessary space. "I know what that fear feels like," Cash said. "I've been there. When you're not sure if there's anything left when you take away the thing you've been hiding behind." Carson finally managed to speak. His voice was rough, barely controlled. "It's terrifying," he said. 2 words. But they contained 30 years of carefully maintained distance, 30 years of performance, 30 years of never letting anyone see the fractures. The audience did not know whether to applaud or stay silent. This was not entertainment. This was witnessing. After the commercial break, Carson had regained his composure. The mask was back. He steered the conversation to lighter topics, and Cash, understanding that the moment had passed, allowed it. They talked about music, they talked about memories, they laughed, but something had happened that could not be undone. For 3 minutes, Johnny Carson had been completely, vulnerably human on television, and Johnny Cash had been the one to make it happen. When it came time for Cash to perform, he chose a song carefully. Not one of his hits, not Ring of Fire or Folsom Prison Blues. He chose a gospel song, Were You There When They Crucified My Lord? It was a song about witnessing suffering, about being present for pain, about not looking away. He sang it quietly, almost conversationally, as if he were alone in a room with one other person. Carson sat behind his desk, watching. His hands were folded. His expression was still. When Cash finished, there was a long moment of silence before the applause began. Carson stood. He walked over to Cash, and instead of the usual handshake, the usual professional goodbye, he embraced him. It was awkward. Carson was not a man who hugged, but he held on for several seconds, and when they pulled apart, his eyes were red. "Thank you," Carson said quietly. The microphones barely caught it. Cash nodded. He understood what Carson was thanking him for. Not the performance. Not the appearance, for seeing him, and for not turning away. The footage aired a few days later. NBC did not cut the vulnerable moment. They left it in, and the response was immediate. People called it the most powerful moment in Tonight Show history. They said it was the first time they had ever seen the real Johnny Carson. They said it was beautiful and devastating and honest. But what they did not fully understand was the cost. Carson hated it. He hated that he had lost control. He hated that millions of people had seen him break. For a man who had spent his entire life maintaining emotional distance, it felt like a failure. He never spoke publicly about that night. In the few interviews he gave after retirement, he avoided discussing it. When people asked, he deflected. But years later, after Carson's death in 2005, Ed McMahon spoke about it. He said Carson had called him after the taping, late at night. Carson rarely called anyone. But that night, he needed to talk. He said Cash had done something no one else ever had, McMahon recalled. He'd gotten past all the defenses, and Johnny didn't know whether to be grateful or furious. In the end, McMahon said, Carson was both. Johnny Cash never discussed that night in detail either, but in his autobiography published in 1997, he wrote a single paragraph about it. There are moments when you realize that the performance has to stop, that the kindest thing you can do for someone is to be honest, even when it's uncomfortable. Johnny Carson was a good man who spent his life protecting himself from the world. On one of his last nights, I tried to tell him that it was okay to stop protecting. I don't know if he ever believed me. Cash lived another 11 years after that night. He recorded the American Recordings albums. He became a legend all over again. He watched June die in 2003 and followed her 4 months later, but he never appeared on late-night television again. Some people said it was because he was too ill, too old, too removed from the mainstream. But those close to him knew differently. He had said what he needed to say to the person who needed to hear it. There was nothing left to perform. Carson spent his retirement in Malibu, isolated in private. He played tennis. He watched television. He avoided public appearances. He sent jokes to David Letterman, but never came on the show. He died in 2005 of emphysema, alone in his home except for his wife, Alexis. In his final years, a few people close to him said he had softened, that he had allowed himself in small ways to be more vulnerable, to admit when he was lonely, to acknowledge that the distance he had maintained his whole life had cost him something irreplaceable. Whether that change had anything to do with what Johnny Cash said to him on stage in May 1992, no one can say for certain, but Ed McMahon believed it did. Johnny thought about that night for years, McMahon said in an interview in 2008. He never said it changed him, but I think it planted something, a question he couldn't ignore anymore, about whether the performance was worth what it cost. The footage still exists. You can watch it online. You can see the moment Carson's face changes. You can see the struggle. You can see Johnny Cash, steady and calm, holding space for another man's fear. It lasts less than 5 minutes. But in those 5 minutes, two of the most guarded men in American entertainment let the world see what they had spent their lives hiding, that they were afraid, that they were uncertain, that they did not have all the answers, that they were, despite everything, simply human. What made that moment so powerful was not the breakdown itself. Public figures cry on television all the time. Emotions are performed, managed, packaged for consumption. But this was different. This was a man who had built an entire career on never breaking, finally allowing himself to break. And it was another man who understood that same burden, giving him permission to do it. It was an act of profound kindness. Because Cash did not do it for the audience. He did it for Carson. He knew Carson's time was ending. He knew the fear Carson was carrying. And he knew that Carson would never admit it unless someone forced the door open. So he did. He risked the friendship. He risked the moment. He risked making Carson hate him. Because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to let them hide. In the years since, that moment has taken on an almost mythical quality. People remember it as the night Johnny Carson cried, the night the unbreakable man broke. But that is not quite accurate. Carson did not break that night. He bent. He allowed himself, for just a moment, to be seen as he actually was, afraid, uncertain, human. And then he pulled himself back together and finished the show. Because that is what both men had learned to do. They bent, but they did not shatter. They carried unbearable weight, but they did not collapse. They survived. And sometimes, survival is the most radical act of all. The final moments of that episode are quieter than the earlier confrontation. After the commercial break, after Cash's performance, Carson wrapped up the show with his usual professionalism. He thanked his guests, he smiled at the camera, he gave no indication that anything unusual had occurred. But if you watch closely, you can see something in his posture, a slight relaxation, a subtle shift. He looked tired, but he also looked, for perhaps the first time in 30 years, like he was not carrying quite as much weight. It did not last. By the next episode, the armor was fully back in place. But for one night, Johnny Cash had given Johnny Carson a gift, the gift of being seen, and the gift of knowing that even when you are seen, especially when you are seen, you can survive. Today, both men are gone. The Tonight Show continues without Carson. Country music continues without Cash. The world moves on, as it always does. But that moment remains. A moment when two legends, two icons, two men who had mastered the art of performance, stopped performing. A moment when Johnny Cash looked at Johnny Carson and said, "I see you. I know what this costs. And you are not alone." A moment when Johnny Carson, for once in his life, allowed himself to believe it. That is the moment that was never supposed to happen. The moment that broke every rule both men had lived by. The moment that revealed what both had spent their entire lives trying to hide. That beneath the performance, beneath the control, beneath the carefully maintained distance, they were just two men trying to survive the weight of being human. And sometimes that is the heaviest burden of all.